History is full of epic battles, legendary heroes, and tragic betrayals, but few stories have captured the imagination like the Trojan War. It's a tale of gods and mortals, love and vengeance, pride and destruction. A war sparked by the abduction of a queen, fought over 10 long years, ending in fire, blood, and the fall of an entire city. But how much of it is real? Did the Trojan War actually happen? Or is it just a myth woven into poetry and passed down through generations? To answer that, we need to go back more than 30 years to the late Bronze Age, when powerful kingdoms ruled the Eastern Mediterranean, and trade, diplomacy, and war shaped the fate of empires. At the heart of this story are two cities: Troy, located in what is now northwestern Turkey, and Mycenae, a mighty kingdom on the Greek mainland. The war between them was immortalized in the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. These works became foundational texts of Western literature, shaping our understanding of heroism, fate, and human nature. But Homer wrote centuries after the supposed events took place around the 8th century BCE, drawing from oral traditions passed down by bards and storytellers. So, where does history end and legend begin? Let's start with the most famous version of the story, the one told by Homer. According to the Iliad, the Trojan War began because of a divine beauty contest. 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, were invited to judge which of them was the fairest. The prize was a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." Zeus wisely refused to choose, so the task fell to Paris, a prince of Troy. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera promised power and dominion over Europe and Asia. Athena offered wisdom, skill in war, and victory. Aphrodite offered the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, wife of King Menelaus of Sparta. Paris chose Aphrodite, and thus he traveled to Sparta as a guest of Menelaus, only to seduce or abduct Helen and return to Troy with her, a massive diplomatic crisis. Menelaus called upon his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and leader of the Greek forces, to help him retrieve Helen. Thus began the Trojan War. For 10 years, the Greeks laid siege to the great city of Troy, led by warriors like Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Hector. But, despite their numbers and strength, they could not break through the mighty walls of Troy until one final trick brought the city to its knees. Odysseus devised a plan to build a giant wooden horse, hide soldiers inside, and offer it to the Trojans as a peace offering. They accepted, dragging the horse into the city gates. That night, the hidden Greeks emerged, opened the gates, and allowed the waiting army to pour in. Troy burned. Helen was returned to Menelaus. The Greeks sailed home victorious, or so the story goes. Now, let's look at what archaeology and ancient records tell us about this war, and whether any of it actually happened. The first major breakthrough came in the 19th century, thanks to a German businessman turned archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann was obsessed with Homer. He believed the Trojan War was real and set out to prove it. In 1870, he began excavations at a site called Hisarlik, located in modern-day Turkey. There, he uncovered the ruins of a city that had been destroyed multiple times, and one layer, known as Troy VIII, showed signs of war and sudden destruction around the late 13th or early 12th century BCE. This matched up roughly with estimates of when the Trojan War might have occurred. The city had strong defensive walls, signs of fire, and evidence of hasty burials, all consistent with a violent siege. But did this mean it was the real Troy of Homer? Not necessarily. Many scholars argue that if there was a real Trojan War, it may have been far less grand than Homer described, perhaps a small regional conflict between Greek-speaking raiders and a city-state in Anatolia. The Hittite archives clay tablets found in central Turkey provide some intriguing clues. The Hittites were a powerful empire during the late Bronze Age, and their records mention a region called Wilusa, which many believe corresponds to Ilios, another name for Troy. In these documents, there are references to conflicts involving a local ruler named Alexandru, who bears a striking resemblance to Alexander, another name for Paris. There are also mentions of disputes over territory and alliances with groups that may be related to the Greeks referred to in Hittite texts as the Ahiawa. These connections suggest that there may have been real historical events behind the Homeric tale, even if they were later exaggerated and mythologized. So, what caused such a conflict? One theory is that it wasn't about Helen at all, but rather about trade routes and access to the Black Sea. Troy sat at a strategic location near the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and beyond to the Black Sea. Control of this area meant control of vital trade networks. Greek merchants would have wanted access, while the Trojans may have resisted foreign incursions leading to periodic clashes. Another possibility is that the war was part of a broader pattern of late Bronze Age instability, where various powers, including the Hittites, Egyptians, Mycenaeans, and others, vied for dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. We know from other sources that this was a time of increasing warfare, shifting alliances, and growing tensions. In fact, some historians suggest that the collapse of several major civilizations around 1200 BCE, including the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and Egyptian New Kingdom, may have been triggered by waves of invaders known as the Sea Peoples. Could the Trojan War have been one of the last echoes of this turbulent era? Perhaps. Now, let's talk about the people involved. Who were the Greeks? By the late Bronze Age, the Greek mainland was dominated by the Mycenaean civilization, named after the city of Mycenae, home of King Agamemnon in the Homeric tradition. The Mycenaeans built fortified palaces, developed a writing system called Linear B, and engaged in extensive trade across the Aegean and beyond. Their society was highly militarized, and their leaders often went to war over resources, prestige, and control of trade. They worshiped gods similar to those in Homer's epics Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, though their religious practices were more ritualistic and less focused on individual heroism. As for the Trojans, they appear to have been an Anatolian people, possibly influenced by both Hittite and Greek culture. Troy itself was wealthy, well-fortified, and strategically important, making it a tempting target for ambitious rulers. So, was there a real Agamemnon? Possibly. Archaeologists have uncovered rich burial sites at Mycenae, including the famous Mask of Agamemnon, a gold funeral mask discovered by Heinrich Schliemann himself. While the mask is older than the estimated date of the Trojan War, it reflects the kind of elite warrior kings who may have existed during that period. And what about Achilles? There's no direct evidence for a warrior named Achilles, but the concept of a semi-divine hero with unmatched martial prowess fits the Mycenaean worldview, where kings often claimed divine ancestry and supernatural favor. The idea of a fatal weakness symbolized by the Achilles heel also aligns with ancient beliefs about fate and vulnerability. Now, let's examine the siege of Troy itself. How accurate is Homer's portrayal? The Iliad focuses on just a few weeks of the 10th year of the war, centered around the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles. It doesn't describe the entire war, only a brief but intense episode. Still, the poem gives us vivid details about battle tactics, weapons, armor, and the social structure of the Greek camp. Some of these descriptions match archaeological findings. For example, the use of chariots, bronze weapons, and heavy infantry formations is consistent with what we know about late Bronze Age warfare. However, the scale of the conflict with thousands of warriors and hundreds of ships seems exaggerated. Homer describes a Greek force of over 100 men, which is likely a poetic exaggeration. Realistically, armies of the time probably numbered in the thousands, not tens of thousands. A 10-year siege would also have been logistically impossible for pre-industrial societies without reliable supply lines and large-scale infrastructure. Most sieges in antiquity lasted only days or weeks, not years. So, why did Homer say 10 years? Because the number 10 was symbolic, representing completeness, a full cycle. 10 years was the perfect length for a mythic war. Now, what about the infamous Trojan horse? Was it real? No physical evidence supports the existence of a literal wooden horse used to infiltrate the city. But some scholars believe it may have been a metaphor for something else, perhaps a siege engine disguised as a gift, or a clever ruse involving deception and betrayal. Alternatively, it could represent a storm or natural disaster, a horse being a poetic way to describe thunder or lightning. Others suggest the word horse may have been mistranslated, and that the horse was actually a ship, or a secret group of soldiers entering the city under false pretenses. Regardless of its true meaning, the image of the Trojan horse has become one of the most enduring symbols of cunning and deception in warfare. So, what really happened? Based on current evidence, here's a plausible reconstruction. Around the late 13th or early 12th century BCE, a conflict broke out between the Mycenaean Greeks and the city of Troy. The reasons may have included territorial disputes, competition for trade routes, or political rivalries. Troy, already weakened by internal strife or external pressures, faced a series of raids or military campaigns. Eventually, the city fell possibly due to a surprise attack, internal betrayal, or prolonged siege. The memory of this event survived orally for centuries before being woven into the epic poems of Homer. Over time, gods were added, heroes were immortalized, and a local skirmish became a cosmic drama. But beneath the mythology, there may very well lie a kernel of truth. So, was there a real Trojan War? Yes, probably. Was it exactly as Homer described? Almost certainly not. What Homer gave us was not history in the modern sense, but a deeply human story, filled with passion, loss, and the consequences of pride. And that's why it still resonates today. People don't remember wars for their logistics or politics. They remember them for their heroes, their tragedies, and the emotions they stir. The Trojan War may have been small in scale, but its impact has been enormous. It inspired countless works of art, literature, and philosophy. It shaped the ideals of honor, courage, and fate. And it reminded us that even the greatest cities can fall, and that the line between myth and reality is often thinner than we think. We've already established that while Homer's version of the Trojan War is full of gods, divine interventions, and epic battles, it likely has its roots in a real conflict that took place during the Late Bronze Age, between the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. But to understand how this war became such a powerful myth, we need to look at the world that produced it, a world filled with rival kingdoms, shifting alliances, and complex societies that thrived across the Aegean and Anatolia. At the heart of this world were two major powers, the Mycenaean Greeks, who dominated the Greek mainland, and the Hittite Empire, which controlled much of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Between them lay a network of smaller city-states, trading hubs, and strategic outposts, including Troy, or Ilion, as it was also known. Troy was not just any city. It sat at a crucial point along the Dardanelles Strait, the narrow waterway that connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and on to the Black Sea. This made Troy a key player in trade between the Eastern Mediterranean and the lands beyond. Control over this area meant control over wealth, resources, and access to foreign goods. It also meant exposure to conflict. Troy had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, and archaeological evidence suggests that Troy VIII, the layer most associated with the Homeric War, shows signs of sudden destruction, burned buildings, hastily buried valuables, and bodies left unburied. These are classic signs of a siege or violent attack. So, if there was a real war, what might have caused it? Historians and archaeologists have proposed several theories. One theory suggests that the war wasn't about Helen at all, but rather about territory, power, and trade. The Mycenaeans, who were expanding their influence throughout the Aegean, may have sought to gain control of Troy's position near the Dardanelles. This would give them access to valuable trade routes leading into the Black Sea region, where they could obtain metals, timber, and other essential resources. Another theory links the conflict to broader political instability in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age. This was a time when powerful empires like the Hittites, Egyptians, Assyrians, and Babylonians were locked in a delicate balance of diplomacy and warfare. Smaller states like Troy found themselves caught in the middle, forced to choose sides, pay tribute, or risk being conquered. Some scholars believe that Troy may have been aligned with the Hittites, while the Mycenaean Greeks were either rivals or opportunistic raiders looking to exploit weakness. There's also evidence from the Hittite archives clay tablets discovered in central Turkey that mention a region called Walusa, widely believed to be Ilios, the Greek name for Troy. In these records, there are references to a local ruler named Alexandru, which sounds suspiciously like Alexander, another name for Paris, the Prince of Troy who supposedly abducted Helen. There are also mentions of disputes involving groups referred to as the Ahiawa, which many historians believe refers to the Achaeans, an ancient name for the Greeks. These documents suggest that tensions between the Trojans and the Greeks may have existed long before Homer's epics were composed, possibly even forming the basis for the legendary war. So, while the story of Helen may have been added later for dramatic effect, the core of the conflict could very well have been rooted in real political and economic struggles. Now, let's talk about the people involved, both real and mythical. According to Homer, the war was led by King Agamemnon of Mycenae, who commanded a coalition of Greek kings and warriors. Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus of Sparta, was the husband of Helen, the woman whose abduction sparked the war. Other famous figures included Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, and Hector, the noble defender of Troy. But did these people really exist? There's no direct archaeological evidence for individuals like Achilles or Odysseus, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist in some form. Many myths begin with real people who are later exaggerated or transformed by storytellers. For example, Agamemnon is a figure we know more about from archaeology. Excavations at Mycenae have uncovered rich tombs, including the so-called Grave Circle A, where elite warriors were buried with gold masks, weapons, and ceremonial armor. One of these masks was famously dubbed the Mask of Agamemnon by Heinrich Schliemann, though modern scholars believe it predates the Trojan War by several centuries. Still, the discovery reinforced the idea that Mycenaean society was ruled by powerful warrior kings, exactly the kind of figures described in Homer's epics. As for Achilles, his character embodies many of the traits valued by Mycenaean warriors: strength, honor, rage, and loyalty. He is portrayed as semi-divine, the son of a mortal king, and a sea goddess, which fits with the Mycenaean tendency to claim divine ancestry. His tragic death, killed by an arrow to the heel, has become one of the most famous symbols of vulnerability and fate. Interestingly, there are no surviving Mycenaean records that mention a warrior named Achilles, but that doesn't rule out the possibility that he was based on a real person whose deeds were later mythologized. Now, let's take a closer look at the actual fighting. What did a battle in the late Bronze Age look like? Contrary to popular depictions, warfare during this period was not chaotic hand-to-hand combat with swords and shields. Instead, it was highly organized, with chariots playing a dominant role. Chariots were used by elite warriors, kings, nobles, and commanders who fought from a mobile platform, shooting arrows or throwing spears at enemy ranks. Infantry soldiers followed behind, armed with bronze-tipped spears, swords, and large wooden or bronze-covered shields. Armor consisted of helmets, breastplates, and sometimes greaves often made of bronze or leather reinforced with metal plates. Siege warfare was less common than open field battles, but when it occurred, it usually involved wooden siege towers, battering rams, and attempts to breach city walls through mining or fire. So, how does this compare to Homer's descriptions? Surprisingly well. The Iliad frequently describes chariot-borne warriors engaging in single combat, hurling insults and challenges before clashing in deadly duels. The poem also includes detailed descriptions of wounds, weapons, and armor, many of which match what archaeologists have found in Mycenaean graves and fortifications. For example, Homer describes warriors wearing boar's tusk helmets, which have actually been discovered in Mycenaean burials. He also writes about bronze breastplates, towering shields, and spears tipped with bronze, all consistent with the material culture of the time. So, while the scale of the battles may have been exaggerated, the details suggest that Homer, or his sources, had first-hand knowledge of late Bronze Age warfare. Now, let's examine the timeline of the war. According to Homer, the Greeks laid siege to Troy for 10 years, a number that appears again and again in mythology and literature. But was a 10-year siege realistic? In reality, sieges of that length were extremely rare in antiquity. They required massive logistical support: food, water, shelter, and medical supplies for thousands of soldiers. Without reliable supply lines, armies would quickly run out of resources and disband. Most historical sieges lasted only weeks or months, not years. So, why did Homer say 10 years? Because the number 10 was symbolic, representing completeness, a full cycle, or a grand cosmic order. It also allowed for the development of numerous episodes, battles, and character arcs, making the Iliad and Odyssey richer and more emotionally compelling. Still, the idea of a prolonged struggle between Greece and Troy may not be entirely fictional. There may have been multiple conflicts, short raids, or skirmishes spread out over many years, which were eventually combined into a single decade-long war in oral tradition. This kind of compression is common in mythology, where time is fluid and events are shaped by narrative needs rather than historical accuracy. Now, let's return to the end of the war and the infamous Trojan horse. Was it real? There's no physical evidence for a giant wooden horse being used to infiltrate the city. No remains of such a structure have ever been found at Hisarlik, the site of ancient Troy. So, what could the Trojan horse have represented? Some scholars believe it may have been a metaphor for something else, perhaps a siege engine, a storm, or a betrayal from within. Others suggest that the word horse may have been mistranslated or misunderstood. In some ancient languages, the word for horse could also refer to ships, cavalry units, or even lightning. So maybe the Trojan horse wasn't a literal horse at all, but a ship that brought hidden enemies into the city, or a secret group of warriors disguised as allies. Alternatively, the horse could have been a symbol for a sudden attack, a surprise assault that caught the defenders off guard. There's also a theory that the horse was a ritual object, part of a religious deception or psychological warfare tactic. Whatever the truth, the image of the Trojan horse has endured for millennia, becoming one of the most recognizable symbols of trickery and cunning in warfare. So, after the fall of Troy, what happened next? According to legend, the survivors fled, some going east, others west. One of the most famous refugees was Aeneas, a Trojan nobleman who escaped the burning city and eventually made his way to Italy. His journey is chronicled in Virgil's Aeneid. Written centuries later, and according to Roman tradition, Aeneas became the ancestor of Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. This connection between Troy and Rome helped legitimize Roman power by linking it to the heroic past of Greek and Trojan mythology. Meanwhile, the victorious Greeks sailed home, but not without consequences. Many faced hardships on their journeys back. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover. Odysseus wandered the seas for 10 years before finally reaching his homeland of Ithaca, a journey immortalized in the Odyssey. And Menelaus, having retrieved Helen, eventually returned to Sparta, where, according to some versions of the myth, he forgave her and lived out his days in peace. So, whether we're talking about Homer's epics, the epic cycle, or later Roman adaptations like the Aeneid, one thing remains clear. The Trojan War didn't end with the fall of the city. Its consequences rippled through generations, shaping not just mythology, but politics, identity, and culture. Now, let's take a step back and examine the broader historical context again. What else do we know about the Late Bronze Age collapse? Because while the Trojan War may have been a localized event, it was happening during a period of massive upheaval across the eastern Mediterranean. Around the same time, roughly between 1200 and 1150 BCE, several major civilizations collapsed. The Hittite Empire fell. The Mycenaean palaces were abandoned. The Egyptian New Kingdom weakened. And cities across the Levant, Anatolia, and Greece were burned and deserted. Historians call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it marked the end of one of the most interconnected and diplomatically stable periods in human history. What caused it? Scholars point to a combination of factors including climate change, drought, famine, internal rebellions, and waves of invaders known as the Sea Peoples. These Sea Peoples remain mysterious. We don't know exactly where they came from, but Egyptian records describe them as a confederation of foreign warriors who attacked Egypt and other coastal states around the 12th century BCE. Some of their names, like the Peliset, Checker, and Sheridan, are thought to correspond to peoples from the Aegean, possibly even remnants of the Mycenaean Greeks or displaced Trojans. If this theory is correct, then the Trojan War may not have been an isolated event, but rather one of many conflicts that contributed to the chaos of this era. In fact, some historians believe that the destruction of Troy the Aea may have been caused not by the Greeks, but by the Sea Peoples themselves who were moving through the region in search of new lands to settle. This would mean that the Homeric War may have been a memory of an earlier conflict or a symbolic representation of a much larger wave of destruction sweeping the eastern Mediterranean. Of course, none of this proves that the Trojan War was exactly as Homer described. But it does suggest that the story had roots in real historical trauma, a period when cities burned, kingdoms fell, and entire ways of life vanished. So, if the Trojan War was real, even in a different form than we imagine, what did it mean to the people who lived through it? For the Greeks, it became a symbol of unity, heroism, and divine favor. It reinforced the idea that great deeds deserved great rewards, and that glory in battle could lead to eternal fame. For the Trojans, it became a tragedy, a cautionary tale about pride, betrayal, and the cost of war. And for the Romans, it was a foundation myth, a way to connect their empire to the legendary past and justify their dominance over the Mediterranean. Even today, the Trojan War continues to shape our understanding of history, literature, and human nature. It reminds us that war is rarely simple. It's driven by ambition, love, fear, and the desire for power. It shows us how stories evolve, how real events can become legends, and how legends can become truth in the minds of those who tell them. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that behind every myth lies a human experience of loss, longing, and the struggle to make sense of a chaotic world. So, was there a real Trojan War? Yes, almost certainly. Was it exactly as Homer wrote it? No, but that doesn't matter, because what Homer gave us wasn't just a war story, it was a mirror held up to humanity. A reflection of our desires, our fears, our strengths, and our flaws. That's why the Trojan War still matters. That's why we keep telling its story. And that's why, thousands of years later, we're still trying to uncover the truth behind the myth. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real story behind the Trojan War, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. We cover everything from ancient battles and forgotten civilizations to the science and myths that shaped human history. Want to see more videos like this? Leave a comment below with your favorite ancient mystery. Maybe we'll cover it next. Until then, stay curious, keep exploring. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about how we understand ourselves today. See you next time.